Hi and welcome to this video in the QPSMR Insight Up and Running series. In this video we're going to look at defining questions and filters, the nuts and bolts of any questionnaire that you might want to specify and use within QPSMR. So let's start by inserting some questions and then looking at applying filters to some of those questions. And where you'll be doing most of your work is on the project menu. So we'll be going project, and we insert an entry, and by clicking on the insert an entry you'll see that 4 different options come up: question, filter, grid and variable. So we're going to look at a question now. So that's a question with possibly a list of responses, or it might be a number, or it might be an open-ended question, but different types of questions. The second option on the list is where you want to specify a filter that you're going to apply to a question. The third option on the list is a grid, where you perhaps have a rating scale where you want to ask people about perhaps 10 different statements with all the answers to each one, or the responses all being the same, perhaps agree strongly through to disagree strongly. And a variable is where you want to combine answers or responses to questions together from one or more questions to make a variable that you typically use in analysis, or maybe to build a more complex variable, or to use as input to other questions. Now we're not going to cover variables in this video, that's covered in a separate video. So let's start by going to click on question and seeing what we can do when we click on a question. And the first message we're going to get up here is as a recommendation that you use the QPSMR companion for this. So there is an extended version of QPS called the companion that allows you to do a few more things. You do need extra licensing for some of the tools within the QPSMR companion, but there's a whole video series that you can look at to see whether you think it suits your needs, called QPSMR Companion Up and Running. So if you haven't got a companion license, you can look at that to see whether you think it offers you something that the Insight doesn't. So it's an extended set of features that make setting up a questionnaire that little bit more faster. Alright, so I'm going to click past that, and we now come to the main worksheet in which you work to specify questions within the QPSMR Insight platform. And the first thing that you type in is the question number that you want. Now, the name of the question can be pretty much anything you want it to be. It's just better practice to start it with a letter, because then you have some easier tools to use when it comes to handling it in other parts of the program. So I would recommend Q1's a good name to do it, or if you've got sections, maybe AQ1, BQ1, BQ2 and so on. Alright, so I'm going to call my question 1, and over here you'll see there's a drop down with all the different types of questions that you can have on a QPSMR Insight questionnaire. So let's go through this list so we understand each of the different types. And the first one on the list we'll see is a single code only. So that means that there's a list of responses that you're going to give respondents for this particular question, but they can only choose one of them. They can't choose more than one of them. So something like gender would work well, a yes/no question, a rating scale from very good to very poor would work well. But you should take care if you ask a question such as, what's your favourite brand of soft drink? Because you can guarantee that some respondents will give more than one answer or have a joint first, and they won't be able to, or you won't be able to enter that data if you make it single code only. Of course, if you want to restrict people who give more than one answer, that's absolutely fine. But of course, if somebody does give 2 or more answers, you just won't be able to enter that data for that particular question. So single means single, you can't have more than one. The next option on the list is multiple coding allowed. Now that means that any number of answers can be given for that particular question. That could be one answer as well, of course, but it could be any number of answers to that particular question. The next 2 are for collecting numeric data. So the first one on the list here, weight with decimal point, actually I would probably call a real number with floating point decimals. So you could then collect, if you wanted to, 2.95, for example, whereas the next option on the list would only allow you to collect an integer. So if you ask people how many children they've got, that would be fine as an integer, but if you ask someone how far they had travelled and you wanted to allow them to enter decimal places, so they could enter, say, 13.5 kilometres, you would need the option above weight with decimal point. So that's the third and fourth options that you have. Then we come to character questions. Now take care with these. These are easy to misuse. These are not where you want to just insert any text. There's an option further down called Verbatim Text, and that allows you to enter text exactly as it's on the or if it's a paper questionnaire, on the paper questionnaire, or as it's been typed by an interviewer if it's a CAPI interview. But it allows free text, in other words, of up to 1,000 or so characters. Character here means that you're actually going to have a text string that you're either not going to process or mean something. So someone's name or their address is possibly data that you want to collect to put alongside the rest of the data in the record, but you're probably not going to analyze their name. Whereas also you might use this option if a product has a particular name. So if a BS24 was a particular product in a product range, as opposed to a BS25, you might make that character data. But you really should avoid using character if there's a danger that somebody would enter the same answer differently. So, for example, if someone might enter UK for the country they live in, or United Kingdom, the whole word spelt out, that would start to get difficult to put together in analysis if you allowed that. It'd be much better to have a single code only list here that had the list of all the countries so that they could choose an option for United Kingdom or UK. The next option down is text for interviewer. So that's that's just a piece of text that either the interviewer reads out or is information to them in the course of the interview. So that's not a question on the questionnaire as such. It's actually just a piece of text. We've already covered verbatim briefly. That really is just a question where you want to collect open-ended answers, where you want to record exactly what someone said or they perhaps wrote on a paper questionnaire. And that information is processed slightly differently to the rest of the data you're collecting here, in that information is put to a spreadsheet with their serial number so that you can code that data later and group answers together using traditional coding techniques that are used in market research questionnaires. So you might put together all the answers that refer to the color of the product or color of the brand, for example, as one code for analysis. So that's verbatim text. And then finally on the list we've got date and time. They're rarely used in a typical questionnaire. They're mainly present, those two options, for CATI surveys, which is an extended module that QPS has to record times of interviews or times to call back respondents and so on. So we're not going to look at that in this session. So we'll be sticking to these options at the top here, and I'm going to pick single for this particular question, and you'll see now that I can type in the text for the question. So I'm going to ask, do you own a motorbike? So that's the question. Any instructions here for the interviewer could be put in here. So it could say, buy a motorbike, anything that has an engine or something like that. And you can color code that so that different colors apply to different types of people. So perhaps somebody in data entry would have yellow colored instructions, whereas an interviewer might have blue, and so on. So you can invent your own rules for managing that. We're not going to look at all these options here. These are all covered in other videos, which is just basic definition of questions and filters. But we can now move on to the responses, and we're ready to start inserting responses. And we can now just type the list, and we can type in this box here, and the answers, or the list that you type, will appear down here in an increasing list as you type each entry. So I'm going to type yes here, Then I move on to the next one. It's temporarily displayed as less than question mark greater than, but as I type no, you can see that gets replaced, and I can now save that because that's all the answers that I want. There are other tools in here. For example, I could, for example, put a not stated here and apply a reject option to that, so that anybody who didn't answer this question would go into that not stated category, and that would be quite a good thing to do, because it would mean that any tables we produce or analyses we produce later, we could see that it all was added to 100%. You might get 90% saying yes, 5% saying no, and 5% being not stated, so that it adds to 100%, and you can see where the not answers appear. All right, let's click OK to that, and OK to that, and we've specified our first question, and that just now appears in the question worksheet. Now for the second question, I want to ask people how long they've owned a motorbike, but I only want to ask it of people who own a motorbike. So what I can do now is insert a filter in here. So we can select insert entry, choose filter, give the filter a name. I'm going to call it FQ1. And there's two ways of specifying filters, either through syntax or by selections using the insert buttons. So let's click the insert buttons. That's the easier way first. And we're given a list of the questions that there are so far. Well, there's only question 1 in our survey, so it's defaulting to that. And if we want the people who said yes, well, it's already defaulted to that. But if I wanted no, for example, I could just click over here and choose that. You can see there's other options over here. I could pick a range of answers, so that I picked anybody who said yes to no. Not appropriate here, but you can see you can choose a range of answers using the shift key. You could choose people who didn't answer the question that were blank. I can turn the selection negative, so that's people who didn't say 1 or 2, in other words, didn't answer. And I've got other options down here to compare values for being less than and greater than. Well, I only want one response here, and I want the yes. And I also need, of course, to turn off the negative here. And now I can click OK to that, and it just says yes here at the bottom. And I could change that text to something more meaningful, all who own a motorbike. So it's something a bit more meaningful. Now that's one way of specifying. If I click OK, that entry will appear over here as a filter. The other way of doing it is through syntax. Now this takes a little bit more familiarization with QPSMR, but I can click on syntax here, remove this just so I'm starting again, and I could type in the syntax Q1/1, which means that from question 1 I want answer 1. Now there's other syntax to pick up people who say or Q1 answer 2, for example, people who said yes or no, and there's more syntax which we'll be covering in subsequent videos. Again, I can replace the text down here, who own a motorbike, and click OK, and OK, and now that filter has dropped into here with a slightly different symbol to indicate that it's a filter. Now that I've got that filter, I can apply it to a question, which is going to be my next question, which is question 2. Now I can use the tab key, type S, which is the quickest way to choose options from the type there, and so it's over here, it's changed that to single by typing S. How long have you owned this motorbike? So we can ask people how long they've owned the motorbike. And we want to apply that filter we just specified here. So click on filters, apply a question filter, pick from the list of filters, again there's only one, and click this filter here to apply the filter to the entry. You see you can reverse that filter and have the people who didn't give that option or that selection, but I'm going to apply it, and I'm going to close and close again, and you can see now that you have specified it because FQ1 appears alongside the filters box. Now we can proceed with responses just like before, and the responses we're going to put in less than 3 months, 3 months, 6 months, 6 months, to 1 year, here, 3 years, over 3 years, and we can put a not sure in the bottom there as well. So that completes the responses, and you can see down here it will tell me I've got 6 responses. Now, one of the other options on the screen that might make you curious is the old style locations. Now, most data these days is stored as ASCII. It doesn't have to be stored as ASCII. It can be stored as a number of different forms of binary, such as quantum binary and so on. Or you might be matching it up with some old data that's stored in an older form of data. Now, old style locations means that a single coded question will get stored on data locations. Now, if you don't know what data locations are, it means that it uses codes on a column, and then if that's used all those codes in that column, and typically 10 are used, 1 to 9 and 0, it'll move on to the next column. If we uncheck that, what it will do when there are more than 10 answers is it will store it as a 2 or 3 or even 4-digit number to accommodate that data. So rather than storing 10 locations per column, it's going to store it as an integer effectively in the ASCII data. Now, there's a video on that that'll cover that and data storage and using data in a bit more detail. All right, let's proceed, and it's saved that. And now we can go on to our third question, and we'll do a multiple response question this time, which is the default, so we can just tab on which motorbike magazines do you read regularly? Okay, and we can click on responses again, insert the responses, Bikers Weekly, my motorbike, 2 wheels, Bikers Monthly, and let's put on here none of these. And this is a good option, a good chance to show an option in practice here. So for none of these, I would probably check this box here, single response only if present, because we wouldn't want anybody selecting one of these magazines and none of these, because obviously it doesn't make sense. All right, so let's OK that and OK that. And now question 3 drops into our question worksheet. Let's go on to a fourth question. Question 4. Let's have an integer this time. How many motorbikes have you owned in the last 5 years? So here we're just trying to get an integer with the number of motorbikes that someone's owned. Now, in this particular case, we have to set this. You'll see the responses box is masked out, so you can't actually go and type responses in. You're just collecting an integer or the number. But here we have to fill in the width of the field. So always be on the generous side here. If you think anybody could own more than 99, set the width to 3, so they could have up to 999. If you really felt somebody could have more than 999, you might set that to 4. But let's set it to 2, because I'm not going to allow anybody more than 99. You can see while you're in here, you can also set the range of answers. So if you think it's impossible for anybody to have more than 10, you might go 1 to 10 here and check that. Now, if this figure was a percentage, that would be a good example where you would set the width to 3, because it could be 100%, but you would set the range as 0 to 100, because that's probably all it can be for percentage in most cases. All right, so we can click OK to that, and we've inserted our fourth question, which allows us to collect an integer. Let's go on to our fifth question, and here we can set up a verbatim text question, and the question is, how do you enjoy using your motorbike? So this is an open-ended question, and with an open-ended question, that's all you have to enter. There's nothing else to do. The answers will go off to a CSV spreadsheet, but there's nothing else to put in there. unless you wanted to apply a filter, of course. But that's it. Okay, so, and indeed we might apply a filter actually. Then we could actually put that only of people who own a bike, so we could go back and apply that question filter there, so that only bike owners answered that open-ended question. Everybody else would jump past it. So that's a way of using an open-ended question. All right, we're going to look at a grid now. We haven't looked at grids, so we go to entries, and this time we're going to specify a grid, and we give it a name, Q6, and a description. So the description might be Q6 grid. Now grids are slightly different to questions because they're two-dimensional. So it talks about the responses as before. So they would be the answers that you can give to each statement in a grid. So that would be very good to very poor, for example. And the elements you might think as the statements or the questions within that particular grid. So let's go into elements first. So let's ask questions and elements within this. So we might ask one question, but then ask several questions about that particular question. So let's put a question in. How important are each of the following aspects of a motorbike? So that's the question. There's nothing to answer there, but it's the elements they're going to answer about. So we can now insert an element, and appearance of the motorbike is the first thing we want people to rate. Next thing we want them to rate is the cost of the motorbike, maintenance of the motorbike, speed of the motorbike. We'll just do one more. Made a mistake there. Let's just get back. And the cost of parts for the motorbike. So there's our 5 elements. We can click OK to that now, and it will confirm that we've got one question with 5 elements. We could conversely have 5 questions, each with a separate element. It's another way of doing it. Or 2 questions, one with 3 elements and one with 4 elements, for example. The responses we're going to put in here are very important. And something you might want to do when you've got a rating scale like this is give it a score, so that automatically when you come to do analysis, scoring will take place. So I'm going to do a score of 2 here. On to the next. Quite important. A score of 1. Neither important nor unimportant. A score of 0. Quite unimportant. A score of -1, and very unimportant. A score of -2. And we might add, for example, another one after that saying don't know, that we apply no score, and then QPS will automatically remove anybody we don't know from any calculations of mean score, standard deviation, and so on, because we haven't given it a score. So there we are. We've now got 1 question, 5 elements, and 6 responses. Click OK, and that question there, that grid or that question drops into the question worksheet. So there we are. We put in 6 questions fairly easily. That's pretty much an overview of how you specify questions, and you put in filters and apply those filters to questions. You can also, if you wish to, specify a filter within a question as well, and it'll just go into the same dialog box. So if we were at question 3, for example, we could click on filters here and apply a question filter and insert a new one, and you're into the same menus and forms that you were when you were specifying FQ1 earlier. So that's just an alternative way of specifying a filter. When you're actually inside a question, it'll have exactly the same effect. So that's the end of this introduction to specifying questions and filters within QPS. I hope it was of use to you. There's many more videos in this up and running series to help you get started with QPSMR Insight. Thank you.